Combining bulletproof Mercedes quality with the style and glamour of a Jaguar E-Type, the R107 generation was arguably peak Mercedes SL, and these days it's one of the coolest and classiest ways into a convertible GT. But there are still plenty of things to look out for on these cars. So here's your guide to buying an R107 Mercedes SL. But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition. Mechanically bomb-proof the R107 might be, but these cars do have an appetite for rust, particularly considering until late 1976 they weren't really rust-proofed from the factory, and that means it's pretty much a given there's going to have been some rot at some point in the car's life. Starting at the front, you want to look at the front valance. Serious area on R107s for corrosion this. They're low, they get a lot of stone chips, road grime and so on. Look at the bumpers, make sure they're not corroded or bent, they haven't crashed into anything. Look at the bonnets, massive heavy panel this and very susceptible to rotting again, so look at the leading edges there, look around the grille for any bubbling or corrosion, because this is a massive and quite expensive panel to replace if that's all rusted out. Then you want to look at the front wings. In the lip of the arch here, has that been collecting any road grime? Look at that for rot. Then look at the trailing edge here where the front wheels will have been flicking up road grime. Look at that as well. The beginning of the sills, all the way down here, the sills can rot out, so go all the way along. Look all the way under down here, because where the floor pans meet the sills, that can rot out as well. These cars, remember, are around 50 years old now, and that means they've been on the road for a long time. There's a lot of weather they've had to suffer through, and indeed a lot of places where they can suffer. While you're in this area here, have a look at the A-post. Just open the doors, make sure the shut line is consistent, the door doesn't drop when you open it, and when you shut it you want that Mercedes thunk when you shut it. Look at the scuttle panel, make sure that's not all rotted out as well. Look at the A-pillar around the windscreen, because if that's rotting out it can let water into the interior, cause all manner of trouble in there. And it's worth paying particular notice around the bottom of the scuttle here, around the windscreen surround, because a killer of R107s, and something that is still a financial write-off for these cars now, is a rotten bulkhead. Basically it starts at the bottom of the car, eats its way up from the inside out, and then effectively the car starts bananaing out as it's rotting from its backbone, and that is a car killer. Doesn't matter how good the car otherwise looks, if it's got a rotten bulkhead, it's throwaway basically. It is an enormous amount of work, particularly if you're not doing it yourself. So any signs of rot around the bulkhead, walk away. That is a proper car killer on R107s. Once you've looked outside and underneath for bulkhead rot, you also want to look for signs of it inside the car as well. Lift the floor mats and look for any signs of water leaking in through the bulkhead that would indicate it's rotten all the way through. And when you've got your feet on the pedals when you're driving, just take a cursory, slide your feet around the pedals and push against the bulkhead. If it feels a bit soft and mushy, could be a bad sign. Once you're absolutely certain that your bulkhead isn't rotten, work your way further back, because there's yet more rotten areas to check for. The doors themselves can rot, so check the edges all the way here if they've been opened onto things and there's paint chips, particularly the bottom edges here. It affects W123s, it affects R107s just as badly. The bottoms of the doors can get very frilly and crusty, and that can affect the inside of the bottom of the doors if water's got past this weather stripping here, gone all the way down, been allowed to sit in the bottom of the door and rotted it out from within. However, Mercedes were one of the first companies to offer true support for their classic models, and that means that pretty much every panel that rots on these cars, like with 123s, like with the W108 SLs and so on, anything that rots on R107s, you can pretty much buy repair panels for. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be financially viable, but it doesn't mean you have to go fabricating everything. So if you've got an open checkbook, restoring one of these cars is absolutely viable. You can get everything for them, such as, working further back, the rear quarters. They can rot out as well. You can get rot around here where the roof joins on, particularly if a car has had a hardtop roof sat on there and it's trapped moisture, so it's worth looking for bubbling in the paint there. Look at the actual shape of the rear quarter. Look down it. Is it a dead straight line? Has it been scraped up against anything? Because that too could be bad. Look at the rear arches. Is it all crusty down here where it joins the sill? Look at the arch lip where it tucks under. This is a big, deep, boxy wheel wheel arch in there, so there's all sorts of potential for stored road grime and of course then rust in that area. And where the rear bumper joins on, make sure that hasn't been rubbing up against it, damaging the paint and rotting this side of the rear arch lip out as well. Look around the petrol cap, make sure that that hasn't got a load of rot in that either. This one is immaculate. And then moving towards the back, look at where the rear lights join on. They can trap moisture and they can cause rotting as well. You can look underneath the rear lights, there can be rot there. Look at the leading edge of the boot lid. In fact, that's a very common area on 123s as well as R107s. Ask me how I know. And that can rot away and get all crispy and crusty, and it's quite a difficult area to repair on the underside of the boot lid there. So you're going to be into a new boot lid if yours is looking a bit crusty. Have a look in the boot itself, because if the boot lid is a bit rotten, particularly on a convertible like this, if it's been letting water in, you could have a rotten boot floor as well. And of course you want to look at the rear valance, another area that can rot on R107s, and then you want to look on the boot floor from underneath. Is it starting to rot out from below? Because again, it affects 123s, it can affect R107s. In summary then, these cars can rot pretty much everywhere from here to here. There is nothing off limits for rust for R107s. However, like I say, if you've got a big enough checkbook, any repair panel is buyable from Mercedes themselves or any number of aftermarket specialists. So actually, restoration needn't be the daunting challenge for one of these that it once was. However, do make sure you check very carefully in that bulkhead. I can't emphasize that enough. Finally, if you're buying an SL rather than the SLC Coupe, you're going to have a soft top folding roof, and it's worth checking that that's in good condition. So pull it up, make sure the whole mechanism is free moving, it's not sea solid, it's not red rusty, and that the roof skin and the back window itself is in good condition. Check that it's smooth, check it's not all creased, look for any little holes in it, because if there are, it's going to get in the interior and ultimately that's going to ruin your trim, maybe even cause rust. Back window, also make sure it's nice and soft and pliable, it's not all milky and there's no splits in it. You can buy replacement soft top roofs for these cars, and of course you can have specialists fit them for you, but it's not cheap. You're going to be well into 3 figures, potentially 4 if you want a really good quality job done. And don't rush the folding of this roof. As we found out before we started filming this video, the full process of folding up and down the soft top on an R107 is a 5 to 10 minute process if you want to do it properly. Look up the video online, it is not quick. And of course you do also need inside this little tool in order to wind the soft top down. So make sure you get that if you buy a car with the roof that's down particularly. The R107 SL has got a reputation for bulletproof reliability. Whether you go for the small 6 or one of the bigger V8 engines, they are all lovely. And in fact, it is just a case of regular attentive maintenance. Good quality oil, regular coolant changes, check your filters, and of course your ignition system components. There isn't really one engine for these cars that's any better or worse for reliability or dependability than any of the others. They're all really, really good. The 2.86 cylinder is a bit weedy for a car so heavy, so it's probably going to have been worked quite hard if the car's been driven a long distance, but it's not the end of the world. If it's been serviced well, there's no reason why you shouldn't choose it. It's worth looking at signs of blue smoke on startup though, because that is pretty much the only Achilles heel of all the engines in the R107. That is valve stem oil seals. So make sure when you go to look at the car, just feel the bonnet before you go and talk to the seller, make sure it's cold, because if it's been pre-warmed, that doesn't necessarily paint a clear picture. Any blue smoke on startup would indicate worn valve stem oil seals or worn valves themselves, which isn't the end of the world because it's a common accepted interval on these cars to change the valves around every 70,000 miles, which a specialist can do for you, and while it's there, it's the same interval for the timing chain, so have that done as well. Other than that, just look for all the usual suspects. Check there's plenty of oil in it, make sure there's no signs of any oil weeping out from anywhere, places like the cam cover. These cars can bung up their PCV breather system, so make sure that all the hoses are in good nick and there's no oil vapor smoke coming from under the bonnet if you've just driven the car on a long run. And generally, as long as it's oil tight, coolant tight, well maintained, and you keep on top of all your servicing and check those valve stems, really there's nothing to worry about engine wise with an R107. These things can go for 250,000 miles without a hint of worry. You could get the small 6s with a manual gearbox, which is fine, but most R107s came with an automatic gearbox, and it just wants all the usual checks. Make sure it goes into each individual gear, make sure it kicks down when you accelerate hard, make sure it doesn't slur the gears or it doesn't hesitate when you're on a steady throttle, make sure it works in reverse. If you want the manual override to work, try that as well, and if you can, just check the dipstick for it, make sure it's got enough oil in it. If it gets a bit noisy but it's otherwise fine, to be honest, just live with it. They are a very well lived automatic gearbox. You can get 250,000 miles out of the gearbox like the engine without any any worries. And it's the same story for the back axle. The diffs can get a bit noisy with age, but generally they are bomb-proof, solid and reliable, just like every other mechanical component on an R107. So if you can live with a bit of noise and it's not too weepy, if a back axle's just a bit whiny, it's fine. The R107 borrows most of its suspension components from other cars in Mercedes' lineup at the time, and as a result it is a fantastically comfy cruiser. It's properly soft and pillowy. It's not the most dynamic car in the world, but nor should it be. Look at it, it's a cruiser. If however it feels a bit too wallery to the point where it's uncontrollable, it probably means that the shock absorbers are worn out. This is quite a heavy car, and don't forget it does absorb a lot of shocks for you. So have a look at the shocks themselves. If they're misting any oil, if the car's just not as composed as you think it should be, new set of shocks are not too expensive or difficult to replace. If you've got any knocks or conks going on from underneath the car meanwhile, that could well be anti-roll bar links. They can flog out over time. Again, big heavy car, remember. Or it could be the subframe bushes. If they're worn out, the whole subframe itself could be physically jolting around and even knocking against the underside of the car, which is very dangerous if it goes wrong. So get under the car, check every bush and subframe link and so on, make sure it's in good health. As for the steering, these cars use a box, which is pretty typical of Mercs of the time, and it gives you that pleasingly soft and light and numb steering feel. These are not precise, sharp steering cars, so why would you need it to be? It is power assisted, and generally it works really, really well. You can turn these cars around with one finger, even at low speeds in tight car parks and so on. But come about 90,000 miles or so, the steering box can wear out. So if the car isn't fingertip light to turn around and it hasn't got a numb but consistent steering feel when you're driving along, there's a good chance the box will want an adjustment or a replacement. Moving on to brakes, nothing special really, just discs and calipers all the way around. If they are sticking, replacements are available, you can rebuild them. All the parts are DIY serviceable and they're not so expensive. So like so many things on an R107, if it ain't broke, which it probably isn't, no need to worry about fixing it. Provided you've got a good roof over your head, the R107 interior is a sturdy, dependable and comfortable place to be. These are really nice sprung seats. And actually we'll start with the seats. There are a few different cloth options like you see in the W123 as well, but the one to talk about here is MB Tex, which is Mercedes' version of leather. It's sort of a vinyl type stuff, and particularly in a car with the roof down that's been exposed to a lot of weather conditions over its life, MB Tex can fade and crack and fail over time. So you're into a full retrim for that, or second-hand seats with different trims on there, which of course might not match, and then you might want to start thinking about maybe changing to cloth or half cloth like we've got in this car here, because then you can get a more sustainable and long-lasting interior. Talking about the seats once again, in the mid-80s heated seats were introduced as an option on the R107, and they are notoriously unreliable with age. The heated seats elements can fail. That is quite an expensive part to put right though, because in order to get to the heated seat element, to replace it, rewire it in, you've got to strip the seat cover off completely, and then you've got to pay for the services of an upholsterer to redo your seats. So decide very carefully whether heated seats are that important to you. On the topic of electrics, you want to check everything electrical in here does work. Do all the warning lights come on and go off when you turn the key on? Does the radio work? Do the lights work? Does everything illuminate properly? Do the windows work? Does the combi stalk on this side work for everything, the wipers and the lights? It's an all-in-one thing, and if it doesn't work perfectly, these are problematic. You are going to be into taking the column apart and replacing it with potentially quite an expensive second-hand replacement. Finally, the central locking. Seems like an odd thing to talk about, but on the R107 and 123, they had vacuum-operated central locking. So it's just rubber pipes with engine-generated vacuum to make the locks work in unison. Now, as these are 50-year-old cars nearly now, those rubber components are going to start to fail. Those will crack, they will let the air in and out, and that will fail vacuum in the system, which means the doors potentially won't lock and unlock together. It's not the end of the world, particularly in a convertible like this. You just put the key in the door, unlock it, then lean over for your passenger. But if you do want your central locking to work, there's a good chance it's down to a failed vacuum hose or the vacuum reservoir itself, which is under the bonnet on the passenger side, which can fail and can be replaced fairly cheaply second hand. So there's everything you need to know to buy yourself an R107 Mercedes SL. But now you know that, which one should you buy and how much should you pay for it? Well, if you fancy yourself a bit of a restoration project, which is totally viable these days, given what the values are like on these cars, you can pay from around £4,000 to £5,000 for a decent, solid restoration project. It's going to have some rust, it might have some electrical gremlins, and there will be some interior trims to sort out as well. But crucially, as long as that bulkhead's not rotten, like we said earlier, the cars are generally viable because mechanically they're not too hard to work on, and generally the parts supply is really, really good for these cars. There's all kinds of special
specialists out there. Up your budget to around £10,000 to £12,000, push as high as 15 if you fancy, and you can get a good roadworthy example probably of a 6-cylinder R107. It's going to be the 280 or the 300. But if you fancy V8 power, it's going to be upwards of £15,000. Push closer to 20, maybe even 25 for a really nice example of either a 350 or the 450 SL, the monstrous 8-cylinder cars. But whichever one you choose, you've got a brilliant car here. The R107 looks gorgeous, it's bulletproof reliable, a lovely cruiser, totally practical. You can put 4 people in these and a load of luggage, and they've got a fantastic club, aftermarket and parts support that mean this really is the kind of classic car that you can use all year round. The R107 is one of those cars from back when Benz meant best.
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.